right. So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our next speaker. He has a long and storied career in the nuclear science and technology field with productive careers at both Oak Ridge and Idaho National Laboratory. He's probably one of the more versatile scientist and engineer out there. I sort of call him a Swiss Army knife of nuclear science and technology. But he is our general chair for this meeting. He's also the president of Battelle Energy Alliance and the director of the Idaho National Laboratory. Please welcome my good friend, John Wagner. John?
Good morning. And thank you, Craig, for the kind introduction. I'm not sure about the Swiss Army knife. I have to think a little bit about that, because Swiss Army knives they're good at a lot of things, but they're not great at anything. But anyway, thank you so much for that. As Craig said, my name is John Wagner. I'm the director of the Idaho National Laboratory, the Department of Energy's Nuclear Energy Research, Development, and Demonstration Laboratory. And I really am very honored to be the general chair for this year's A&S conference. You know, it seems like almost yesterday, to me anyway, that I attended my first conference, and I'm willing to say that was 30 years ago. And so what an honor to go from, you know, I'm sure there's some of you in the room that are entry-level graduate students, maybe here to present your first paper, to being general chair. So Craig, Ken, thank you for the opportunity to do this. I'd also like to welcome all of you to the 2024 American Nuclear Society Conference. Thank you for coming. When we put together the plenary and we start talking about the meeting, of course we hope that you all will come. What makes these meetings great is the attendance and the discussions that happen here. I also want to congratulate all those that just won national awards. What a great honor for all of you. Congratulations. Now, my time here with you today is short, so I'll try to get to the point fairly quickly. Although I'm the director of a research laboratory, I'm not here today to talk about the latest, greatest research innovations or give you an advertisement for Idaho National Laboratory, but rather I'd like to take the time this morning to talk to you about what I call an urgent imperative for near-term commercial deployment. We all know the United States is facing unprecedented energy challenges, from climate change to dramatic growth driven by electrification and the rise of hyperscale data centers, which we're going to hear about in what I think is going to be an outstanding panel following my remarks. Thank you for those who came to that panel. Given our dependency on power, as well as global demand growth, it's a formidable challenge. And that's why a dramatic expansion of nuclear energy is essential. But this expansion, I believe, will not occur. I do not take it for granted. I don't believe it'll happen with a business-as-usual approach. Many of us in this room have attended numerous conferences like this and industry events in our careers. We've had wonderful discussions, made plans, designed countless paper reactors, as Admiral Rickover would call them, and headed home feeling re-energized and accomplished. But far too often, we return to these same gatherings. As I said, I've been doing this for 30 years, maybe it's my fault, with limited progress to show in terms of the actual expansion of nuclear energy. That is beginning to change. The time for nuclear energy expansion has come, again. There's optimism in the air. There's broad determination on the ground and in this room. There are public and private demands for firm, clean, resilient energy. I can feel it, and I hope you can too. There's so much to be optimistic about. Our existing nuclear reactor fleet, thank you for all of you who are contributing to that, is excelling and continues to generate the nation's most reliable and resilient electricity, providing firm power to homes, hospitals, schools, businesses, and critical industries. Public and political support for nuclear energy has steadily increased, with bipartisan backing in Congress, at the White House, and in state legislatures across this country. Many of them I've visited personally. Longtime nuclear leaders like Westinghouse, General Electric, the Tennessee Valley Authority, Southern Company are joined by a growing number of nuclear startups, and they're all collaborating with the national laboratories and the universities on innovative reactor designs, fuel development, and associated technologies to address the expanding variety of energy needs that nuclear can serve. As Craig mentioned, and we've all celebrated, Vogtle Units 3 and 4 are now online in Georgia. I know we applauded for them before, but every time I say that, I want to applaud. It changes the dynamics for our future that Southern Company had the perseverance and leadership to see those projects through. So I want to personally thank the leadership of Southern Company, and I'd ask for another round of applause. In addition, the Natrium Reactor Demonstration Project broke ground in Wyoming last week, and several advanced reactor projects are planned and progressing in states across this nation. Industry giants and major energy end users such as Dow Chemicals, Nucor, Amazon Web Services, Meta, Google, Microsoft are increasingly looking at nuclear energy to secure uninterrupted carbon-free power for their operations. And nations in Europe, Africa, Middle East, South America are considering advanced nuclear to provide the clean energy their people need. Today, the focus has shifted from debating the need for nuclear energy to determining how much we need. The White House and Department of Energy set the goal at an additional 200 gigawatts of new nuclear by 2050, which of course would be tripling our current capacity. We are now discussing how to enable first movers and how many gigawatts can be deployed by 2035 in order to achieve the 2050 goal. I'm hearing people ask not if we will build more AP1000s, but how many, where, and when, something, frankly, I could not have predicted only a few years ago. We are on the cusp of achievements that could usher in a new era of nuclear expansion and reestablish our global leadership. But getting there, in my opinion, requires successful, near-term commercial deployments. Despite widespread public acceptance, which we've celebrated, bipartisan support, enthusiasm in this room, a clear need, the U.S. nuclear industry remains at what the Department of Energy has characterized as a commercial stalemate between potential customers and the investments in the nuclear industrial base. Something we'll delve into in the final panel of this plenary. I'm absolutely thrilled to have the Secretary of Energy and the CEOs of TVA and Southern Company here to talk with us in the final panel of the plenary. Primarily due to cost and schedule uncertainties, many stakeholders prefer to wait and observe before committing to new reactor projects. While understandable, these decisions prevent us from realizing the cost and schedule benefits associated with progress towards nth-of-a-kind deployment. In contrast, widespread deployment has led to dramatic cost reductions in wind, solar, and other advanced technologies, including storage. So I believe to regain our leadership status and meet the nation's mandate for clean energy, we must advance commercial nuclear deployments and do so with urgency, a strong focus on cost and schedule, and an understanding of the needed scale. I believe we need to focus on major outcomes, like getting the next 100 gigawatts online. Think about that, the next 100 gigawatts online. I believe that's what we should be talking about. To do so, we need energy developers and users to come off the sidelines, and a clear understanding of the financial and policy support required to enable first movers. Yes, as I said, I lead a research laboratory, but I've gotten more and more interested in understanding the value of those policies that will drive these people off the sideline to make these decisions. And again, I look forward to talking about that with the CEOs of Southern Company and TerraPower. We also need a regulatory structure and process that is predictable and promotes innovation, investment, and deployment. Policies like cost overrun insurance, long-term power purchase agreements, I believe must be pursued to incentivize deployment and reduce the barriers for early adopters. We should ask, I believe, if our long-held aversions to risk and our ingrained conservatisms towards things like health effects of radiation, and licensing, building, and delivering new nuclear plants are in society's best interests when considering the stark realities of climate change, energy demand, and geopolitical considerations that we face today. We must also develop a domestic fuel supply, of course, for current fleet and future advanced reactors. We need to develop the supply chains necessary to ensure that the systems we build today can produce clean energy for their lifetimes, which we all realize could be up to as long as a century. And of course, as Craig spoke about, and A&S has been a leader on, we must prioritize STEM education and workforce development to pull this off. I'm pleased to say that progress is occurring in each of those areas that I mentioned, and I'm heartened by that. But as I wrote in a column for this month's edition of the Nuclear News, expansion depends on overcoming the inertia of more than 3 decades of not routinely deploying new commercial nuclear in this country. That happens to coincide with my career too, so I don't know if I've actually had a negative impact or not. But I always think about, I graduated with my bachelor's in 1992, and we have actually, other than Vogtle Units 3 and 4, we have not started and finished a new power plant in that entire career period. So I don't know if I should apologize. For the U.S. nuclear industry to move forward, its contributions, of course, to grid stability, economic growth, environmental sustainability, and national security must be duly recognized. I would argue that they mostly are, but also valued. At the same time as nuclear energy advocates and leaders, we must rise to this moment by doing our part to enable deployment. So in closing, my message this week is simple. We need to build, and we need to get started now. This year's A&S conference is themed, as Craig spoke about, all in on nuclear deployment. The stakes have never been higher. We had some great discussions as we settled in on that theme. We chose that theme, Craig already explained it pretty well, but because we have come so far, but there are major hurdles yet to overcome. As a community, I hope we will collectively commit to meeting this moment together. This moment requires us to be bold, to be creative, and not just in technology space, but also in policy and financing, to challenge the status quo of how we've been performing, and be willing to take calculated risks, perhaps more so than we've been willing to in the past, and help others understand what's at stake, not just for the nation, but the planet. We must do this because truly, the stakes have never been higher. I want to thank you each for the role that you're playing or will play in the future to enable this. And I also want to thank Ken and Craig for the opportunity to be with you here today. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing my friend and colleague, Mike Goff, who is moderating the next panel on data centers and AI. Mike Goff, as I said, is a friend and colleague, but more formally, he is the Acting Assistant Secretary for the Department of Energy's Office of Nuclear Energy. I was joking with Mike earlier. I won't say how many years of experience Mike has, but it's extensive. Before joining the Department of Energy in his current capacity, Mike actually had multiple detail assignments in Washington, D.C. for the Department of Energy and also for the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Before that, he had a long, distinguished career, even during part of that, at the Idaho National Laboratory, and prior to that with what was called before Argonne West. He is an expert in not only technical issues around fuel cycle and reactor technologies, but also, I would say, in policy, foreign policy, those sorts of interactions. Mike is a phenomenal individual. Let's give a round of applause to Mike Goff, who will be leading the next panel.
Good morning, everyone. I want to start by first thanking the American Nuclear Society for inviting me to this annual conference and for giving me the opportunity to moderate this panel with these esteemed guests here. I also want to thank John for that nice introduction there, and also thanking him for persevering against Craig's earlier wishes on the topic of this panel. I think the topic of this panel is spot on what we should be focusing on right now. There has been really amazing buildup and action and support for nuclear energy in the United States and around the world that has manifested itself well in the past few years, and I want to say especially in the last few months, and again, should be highlighted by this panel this morning. This administration has really championed clean energy legislation that recognizes the importance of nuclear energy to meet our energy security, which is national security, and emission reduction goals. The Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS Science Act, the FY24 National Defense Authorization Act, and appropriations all have significant new authorizations and appropriations that will fundamentally alter the direction of commercial nuclear in this country. This is a call for action for this generation of nuclear engineers and scientists, welders, skilled labor, policy wonks, communicators, financiers, educators, and government employees to push forward. We have the tools to make America the leader in nuclear energy again. The United States created this industry, and we have built nearly a quarter of the world's reactors. We can do this again, and I think we can also double that building as well to get out to that tripling nuclear pledge. Building on this momentum, we have continued to push the path toward deployment. As our secretary, who you'll get to hear in a little bit, has continued to say, we need to be focusing on deployment, deployment, deployment. In March of this year, the Secretary of Energy launched what we've called Vision for the Future initiative, which really aims to push industry to move forward to scale advanced nuclear quickly to meet our domestic and global energy objectives. In late May, as John noted, the White House also hosted a summit on domestic nuclear deployment, which highlighted the collective progress that has been made in nuclear energy in both the private and public sectors. Just a few weeks ago, I was pleased to be able, along with the Secretary of Energy, to visit Vogtle Nuclear Power Plant to celebrate the completion and commercial operations of both Units 3 and 4, which makes the Vogtle site the largest source of clean energy in the United States. And I'll note, as the Secretary noted in her remarks there, that's just 2 down, 198 to go. So we got a lot of work here to be focusing on this. But those 2 Westinghouse AP1000s are the first new reactors built in the United States in over 30 years, and were the result of the efforts and collaborations between utilities, developers, end users to finance the new nuclear projects, as well as the over 35,000 workers that were trained as part of building that, many of who are union workers. And also to thank the residents of Georgia who helped these projects to reach a successful outcome. At the end of this month, I'll note also the Office of Nuclear Energy, we hope to be releasing a request for proposals for the expansion of our low-enriched uranium supply chain in the United States as well, to make sure that we have a secure supply chain from trusted allies to meet these demands for these reactors to be deployed. So again, I'm very happy to be moderating this panel and look forward to our panel discussions here today. Let me note, we're going to go through and ask some questions here with the panelists, but we also hope to be taking questions from you as well toward the end. So if you want to submit your questions via the QR code, you can start thinking about those now. So we do have 4 great panelists here to discuss some of the opportunities and challenge to enable the accelerated deployment of new clean nuclear energy to help drive our economy. So just quick introductions. The first is going to be Peter Freed here from the Clean Energy's Buyer's Allowance, who also spent a lot of time at Meta and all as well. Then we have, we changed order. Okay, now we got my orders going. Then we have Adrian here as well, Adrian Anderson from Microsoft. Then we have Adam Stein from the Breakthrough Institute. And then we have Briana Kobor from Google. So to start this off, I'm going to ask each of them in order the way they're sitting here on the stage right now, to go through and ask them to take a few minutes to talk about why their organization is interested in increased deployment of nuclear power and how that perspective may have differed now as opposed to 2 to 3 years ago. So, Peter, I'll ask you to go ahead and start off on that.
Great. Well, let me start just by thanking you all for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be here, and such an exciting time, both for this industry and for the power sector at large. My personal trajectory on the issue of nuclear energy actually probably started, at least in its most recent iteration, 4-ish years ago, with a conversation with John Wagner, who I met at an event. He was incredibly generous with his time and allowed me to just pepper him with questions about this technology, safety, reliability, clean energy, all of these things. And I started thinking, boy, I was with Meta at the time, maybe this is something that the company should be thinking about. Fast forward to about a year ago, and we really began to think more seriously about how nuclear energy might fit into the mix for the company. And at that time, I think at least my perspective was that it was likely a nice-to-have technology. Forgive me, I know many folks in the room disagree with that and think it's a need-to-have, but at that time I was thinking, all right, nice-to-have, maybe we should start working on this. This is something that we should figure out how to engage on. Fast forward now, about a year later, and I have spent maybe the last 15 years working on large loads, thinking about how we can cleanly, reliably, affordably interconnect loads to the system. And having had conversations across the course of the last year, really thinking about how we rise to this moment of the load growth equation that we're seeing both in the data center space and elsewhere in the economy. And it's become clear to me that nuclear technology is a need-to-have technology, that this is something that we will absolutely need in order to meet the objectives that we've set out as an industry, that the nation has for clean, reliable, affordable, safe power. And so that is the reason that I'm so thrilled to be here talking with all of you today, and hopefully learning a lot too. There's plenty that folks in our part of the industry, these buyers, these large end users, need to learn about this technology and how it's going to fit into the mix moving forward.
So I've known Peter for a long time. That's him being thrilled. Sorry.
Thrilled.
So I'm the general manager of carbon-free electricity, CDR, and renewable electricity for Microsoft. Yeah, I would say a couple years ago when I guess it's about 4.5, 5 years ago, in 2020, Microsoft committed to being 100% covered by renewable energy in this coming year, and then being completely carbon neutral for Scope 2 emissions in 2030, with 50% of our Scope 3 emissions covered as well. 4 years ago, our load growth was pretty awesome. Cloud was growing, it was great, it was double digits year over year, and then AI sort of started developing about 18 months ago. And from then on, our growth curve went from being exponential to kind of looking like a wave and bending back over on itself. And we don't have the luxury of sort of stepping back from our commitments of being sustainable and committing to our customers to be carbon-free across the board. Microsoft's commitment is to every market where we operate our 300+ data centers. We want to assist our customers. We want to decarbonize the grid, not just for our own loads, but for every other ratepayer in those markets. 4.5 years ago, I would have said at 34+ gigawatts of contracted renewable assets, we probably would be there, which we're in excess of that now. We are not. With load growth where it is, we need continued development of clean, firm resources, and nuclear fits that bill. Not to mention when we are starting to talk about data centers that aren't just a couple hundred megawatts, they might be 500 megawatts, they might be a gigawatt, they could be 5 gigawatts, depends who you talk to. You need a lot of renewable or clean, firm electricity, and from intermittent resources, you can't get there right now. So nuclear for us is a really important piece of that pie. Whether it's SMRs, whether it's microreactors, whether it's larger AP1000 units, we think it's a complete mix of the above. We know that there's a lot of blockers, and we think we can take our buying power and apply that to this market. And the idea of us sort of coming in and standing long-term behind these assets as an off-taker is something that's really attractive to us. So we hope that we can continue to push that market.
The Breakthrough Institute has been an advocate for nuclear energy for more than a decade. That hasn't changed, but about 3 years ago when I built the nuclear energy specific program, we went back and retested all of the assumptions to not just be advocates, but be experts. We've looked at mining footprints, environmental impacts, the ability to get to net zero clean energy without nuclear. And in every case, we come up with nuclear is actually necessary to protect the environment and achieve net zero. After that, we identify the actual barriers that we think are in the way of deploying enough nuclear energy to get to that end goal and pragmatic solutions to get there. And some of them are not necessarily what you would expect, but many of them are not a single thing that you have to do to clear the way for nuclear, period. There are many individual small things that have to be adjusted from the status quo to make any progress. And we're continually working on that problem and trying to find new partners to work with to help achieve those goals, but that's currently where we are at.
All right, let me see by a show of hands. How many of you have taken out your phone and accessed your email or your news feed already today? Okay, now be honest, how many of you are doing that right when I asked that question? All right, thank you for being active data center users. The fact of the matter is that data centers are the backbone of our modern economy. Google's products help get people from point A to point B using Google Maps. We help doctors provide care to their patients. We help small businesses reach their customers. And we help families around the world see and talk to each other, no matter where they might live. In a recent study, the US Department of Commerce found that the digital economy accounted for more than 10% of US GDP and employed nearly 8 million people in this country. Data centers are behind the technology that help every organization understand their business, connect with their people, and operate in our economy today. As Google's head of energy innovation, I spend my time thinking about how we can use where we sit in the market to support strengthening our electric grid to support our growth, as well as the growth of the system as a whole. We have an ambition to be powered by 24/7 carbon-free energy by 2030. And that requires us to shift our focus from our historic 100% renewable energy goals, focused on putting a lot of wind and solar on our grids where it's cheapest to match on an annual basis, to think into a more integrated and collaborative system. So our own modeling shows that when we include advanced technologies in the mix, this is advanced nuclear, enhanced geothermal, long-duration energy storage, we expect to see a 40% reduction in Google's costs to achieve our goals, even at today's cost estimates. And we also see a 40% reduction in the total megawatts needed. So I think the case for nuclear is clear when it comes to where Google sits in the market, and we're really excited to be having this conversation today.
Thank you all very much. So let me first turn to Peter here. In your time at Meta and on the board of the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance, you have been exposed to a wide variety of organizations interested in clean energy solutions to fill the organizational gaps in expertise, provide exposure to industry best practices, and to identify potential procurement paths. What are some of the questions or concerns CEBA hears most frequently from those who may be interested in nuclear to achieving the clean energy goals?
Yeah, this is such an important question. And I know that this panel is theoretically focused on data centers and AI, but I do just want to take a second, particularly coming from the perspective of someone that sat on the board of CEBA for more than 5 years, looking at a wide spectrum of clean energy buyers, that we've spent the last 24 months passing a wide variety of legislation focused on electrifying everything, and we have talked about load growth as what I believe is likely the greatest economic development and national security opportunity that we've had since World War II. This is a really interesting and important moment in time for the electricity sector. So as we think about where and how nuclear fits into that equation, I think the first two questions that buyers are always going to have is, how much does it cost, and when is it going to be available to me? And the truth is, right now, there aren't great answers to that question. I think that answers can be found, and probably without that much challenge to find them. But if we are going to deploy the power of the buying community, and I know that that power is significant because those buyers bring the ability to drive long-term credit-worthy offtake, which means they will buy the power from these projects, which unlocks many other opportunities, particularly with respect to finance, with respect to permitting, with respect to utility arrangements, and otherwise. These folks do need to understand how to buy this stuff. What is it going to cost? When is it going to be available, whether it's for data centers, manufacturing facilities, electrified industrial loads, et cetera? That's the first question. And so that constituency understands how to buy power, they understand how to buy clean power, and they understand how they can put building blocks together to achieve the exact same things that every other electricity customer wants: clean, reliable, affordable, safe power, which of course nuclear technology can achieve and deliver, in fact, likely better than many of the other technologies that are available today. And so I think figuring out how to get from where we are today to a place where it fits into the buying model that large buyers are used to is going to be the thing that we have to do and that we have to bridge. And it's great that many of the folks that are sitting here with me on the panel have already started trying to figure out how to bridge that gap, how to do that procurement. But that's really what folks are after, is understanding, all right, I've been buying wind and solar as clean energy sources for quite some time now, more than a decade in many cases. How do I figure out how to bring this new technology into the mix? And I think that's the really exciting thing where we're starting to see development and advancement in the sector over the course of certainly the past 6 months, and I think it's going to be a very exciting year ahead as well.
Okay, I think that's a good segue for a question for Adrian here too. So Google and Microsoft are working with Nucor to develop a new business model to aggregate clean energy demand, to accelerate the first of a kind and early commercial clean energy projects, including advanced nuclear. At the end of May, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft signed an initial agreements with Duke Energy to develop new power contract terms aimed at lowering the cost of building new nuclear technologies and batteries. Why are these new types of models needed, and can you tell us a little bit about how they're expected to work?
Sure, I can tell you a little bit because we don't know fully, but yeah. Or
maybe how you would like them to work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we came at the AMC because we have scale, right? Like, we need a lot of power. We need it relatively quickly. We, like Google, have a 2030, 24/7 carbon-free goal. Obviously, if we talk about nuclear timelines, that's looking at uprates and relicensing and plants that are online to help us meet those goals. But our goals are much longer term. We want to decarbonize. So the idea of creating the AMC was to send a signal to the market that we're not just sort of exploring this right now. We're not wanting to talk to folks and kind of get some indicative terms, that we really want to move quickly. When we established the AMC and announced it, we did an RFI and we gave people, gosh, I think it was 21 days to submit. We got 230 some odd proposals. We have brought that down to a short list of less than 15, and I think we are going to begin in earnest contract discussions with a large handful of those. Some of them are nuclear. The idea was to move relatively quickly, bring our ability to, like Peter said, we're best suited to be long-term credit-worthy offtake. We spend a lot of time developing really innovative contract structures for new products and things like that, and so we're trying to bring that together. Nucor has a very different need in sort of their electricity profile than both Google and Microsoft and some others. So trying to bring not just tech voices to the party, but bring heavy industrial, bring electric vehicle makers, whoever, into the party so that we can show that, look, it's not just 100 megawatts that we need gigawatts, and we want to aggregate that, and we want to go from first of a kind to nth of a kind. And the issue, first of a kind is going to be very, very different, right, than nth of a kind, but we want to send that signal so that you can develop supply chains, you can develop all of the fuel necessary that you need to bring into the US. Hopefully we speed up permitting and licensing through the use of AI and other technologies. We recently ran a hackathon in a month, and they were able to take licensing down, hypothetically, to about a month to process everything into a few hours. So there's a lot of things we're trying to do and bring our brain power together to push not only technology into the space, that use of AI in our computing services, but also to bring our buying power. And then I think the critical piece, sort of asking about business models, we've always come at utilities and kind of butted heads. I've been in the data center space and worked for, gosh, 4 different tech companies now doing this. And we would always go to utilities and say, hey, Southern Company, hey, Duke, we need you to give us 500 megawatts in this location by this date. If you've all looked at the new IRPs for most of these companies, you can't do that anymore. We have to have a collaborative model. So the idea of working with Duke is, look, there are regulatory barriers, there are PUC barriers to working across multiple utilities to come up with a singular tariff type structure with multiple large loads. But how do we sort of identify the issues? How do we address those issues? And how do we bring public, private, and the capital to the party to start moving this forward a lot faster if we can. I think we, in the past, have gone out and only really focused on procurement, like procuring renewables. We can crank out 50 to 60 power purchase agreements in a year, but that's not what's required here, right? There's a financing barrier, there's a risk around construction and cost overruns. We don't want to improperly burden ratepayers and so forth. So we really want to spend we basically think about it like this. We want to go slow to go fast. So we're trying to bring all the right people into the room, figure out multiple structures we can do, and if it's a deregulated or regulated market, and then start to deploy those relatively quickly. And I think from the AMC perspective, we will be able to show some successes in 6 to 9 months, at least from a contractual standpoint.
No, real exciting. I got to admit, your comment though about licensing down to a month with AI also piqued my attention there too. But we'll have to explore that.
I am not an engineer, so I'll happily introduce you to the team that is developing that. But they ran this pilot, and we did it through. We had a TerraPraxis symposium and so forth. It was pretty wild. So that's already being looked at and engaged with by several utilities and so forth to help with that.
Very intriguing. A good topic for another panel here in the near future. So Adam. In November, you published a blog post through the Breakthrough Institute entitled Advanced Nuclear Energy is in Trouble. NuScale cancellation should be a wake-up call for advocates. You highlighted several of the challenges, including high interest rates, commodity prices, constrained supply chain, the regulatory regime, project costs versus system costs, and fuel production. Have you seen calls for more optimism since November? And what challenges do you think remain to be the most significant?
I have not actually seen progress since November, unfortunately, but I have seen more urgency to fix the problems since November. Commodity prices have come down slightly, interest rates are largely still the same, and those are risks, really uncertainties that are outside of the developer's control. Until those can be considered project risks instead of unknown uncertainties, that's not going to be controlled at all, and can drastically swing the price of any single project. That happened with the NuScale estimates. It happened in part with Vogtle as well. The challenge of that is having a more integrated supply chain. We don't currently have a supply chain that already exists to build new nuclear plants in a scale that we would need to achieve this goal. And having that supply chain already in place would help to control some of these swings because they will internalize some of the uncertainty into risks that can be managed. So it's a long road to get to that point, and it's going to take an integrated effort, not just individual smaller firms trying to make their own product the product, and mostly developers that are trying to sell technology or paper reactors that have no physical construct yet to build up the supply chain that needs to occur to actually deploy. Another challenge is regulatory barriers. There has been some effort to modernize the NRC. Most notably in the last decade, the NRC released a strategic plan to modernize, but has achieved less than half of their own strategic plan. The regulator says they're advanced reactor ready, but at the same time they have 30 rulemakings on their own calendar that are in some process of development. So that says that they themselves identify that there is still more work to be done. It's not ready now, but we're moving in that direction. However, we're moving very slowly. Many of the rulemakings take at least 4 years because that's what the rulemaking process is. And then in the middle, we usually have very extensive public comment periods, which are usually beneficial. but then also very extensive commissioner vote timelines. 3 of the major rulemakings that were just finalized within the last year and a half were with the commission after being finalized as a rule, after all the public engagement. For almost 2 years they sat with the commission. The Fiscal Responsibility Act mandated, was immediately enforced, that amendment to NEPA, for instance, that all agencies had to comply with. It took a year for the NRC to propose a rule to enact those changes that were, once again, by law immediately enforced. And it's going to take another 4 years to get that rulemaking completed if all goes well and the commission votes within their normal 60-day timeline. So it's not a matter of, are we ready now? We aren't. And everybody in this room has a role to play to help move things a little bit faster. It's no one single thing or one barrier that is going to prevent deploying new nuclear. It's changing the status quo, as John Wagner said. We will not get there from here without that significant change in every sector. Some of the regulatory paradigms that we just hold as true right now need to change as well. They are not in the public's best interest. The NRC does not consider the general welfare in their own decision-making right now, even though it's in the Atomic Energy Act. So currently, Congress is trying to include that or remind the NRC that it's part of their mission in the Advance Act, which may get voted on as early as tomorrow, where the NRC would have to consider what is in the best benefits to the public in their decision-making process, as long as it doesn't impact safety and the environment. So that change in regulatory thinking to consider what the public needs should help to hopefully move things along in the right direction more quickly.
Thanks very much. Before I ask Briana her question, let me also remind you again, you can input questions via the QR code, which I don't know. Yeah. Oh, you can't pull it up in the app. Okay, then we're probably just going to have some questions up here for a while, unless Allison comes up with some other.
Pass my mic around.
Yeah. We'll leave Allison to figure out. Allison Hummel, who's probably the real general chair for the meeting here, but besides John, we'll see if she can figure that out. But while we're at it, we'll go on to Briana for her question here, which feeds on again. We all need to see our part. We don't need to be doing status quo. So appreciate that y'all been looking at new business models as well from Google. Just last week, you announced a new first-of-a-kind clean energy partnership with NV Energy in this region here that enables Google and other energy users to meet growing power demand cleanly and reliable. The core of this partnership is a clean transition rate, or a clean transition tariff. Tell us more about this new partnership and why it is important for Google, and help us understand what the CTT is and whether it is replicable for nuclear energy and all as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The Clean Transition Tariff is the result of the last 2 years of work engaging with utilities and stakeholders to try to overcome some of these barriers, to see how customers like Google, like Microsoft, and others can get more involved in acceleration of new technologies. So as we focus on pursuit of our own 24/7 goals, there's 2 key issues that we need to address. The first is that we need greater resource diversity. We need to shift our focus from clean energy to clean capacity. And we also need to look at new models that can align capital streams. So the more that we can work together, leveraging customer demand, IRA dollars, and utility planning and investment, the greater our success will be in bringing forward in time these new technologies. As we look around, not the NRC regulatory landscape, but the electric rate regulatory landscape, we find that the existing models are poorly suited to accelerate new technologies. They typically focus on lowest cost renewables and very low value avoided cost credits, which provide diminishing returns both for the utility and for the customer. So we went back to the drawing board and came up with a new model called the Clean Transition Tariff. At its core, the Clean Transition Tariff is about deepening our partnership with the utilities. So in the past, customers like Google have typically transacted for large volumes of renewable energy at the wholesale market level, bringing online gigawatts and gigawatts of renewables. Google has to date signed over 10 gigawatts of renewable energy. That's largely wind and solar. And through 2040, we expect to spend over $10 billion on those power purchase agreements. So the capital is really there. But we wanted to come up with a way to bring those assets deeper into utility planning, because this PPA model typically operates outside of how utilities plan for and operate their system. So the CTT brings that together in a new way. We look for resources that can complement the clean energy that utilities already have on the grid and are planning on investing in on their own. And in exchange for identifying those resources of greater value, we're able to unlock greater value for the customer, which enables us to bring forward in time, even at premium cost, these new technologies. So the CTT moves away from a low avoided cost credit and instead incents the customer with a full power value, including both an energy and capacity offset on their standard bill. We've recently seen some exciting developments in this space. Just last week, we announced our proposal alongside our local utility here in Las Vegas, NV Energy, to bring forward new, clean, firm, enhanced geothermal energy to the grid in Nevada. That's not expected to be online until 2030. And so I think the timeline here is another really key theme. We need to be transacting, we need to be signaling our demand today to keep this industry moving. And as Adrian discussed, we also announced a similar partnership with Duke, which does also include work on development of a clean transition tariff and other really unique elements like novel financial solutions as well, potentially with upfront capital investments. And so we're really excited about this model. It's the same model that we are using to engage actively with utilities across the country for advanced nuclear. Essentially, if there is an energy technology that can provide clean capacity that complements utility resource planning, the CTT provides that pathway to engage with customers to accelerate that deployment.
Thank you very much. Okay, we do have a couple of questions coming in, so either Allison's got very creative or people are figuring out how to access, but we'll toss this first question, I guess, to Briana or Adrian, I guess. But anyone else can chime in on it as well, but go ahead and put you on the spot with this one. Will Microsoft and Google and other companies consider investing directly in advanced nuclear or shift toward the new tariffs being announced? So we'll just go ahead and put you on the spot with that question that everyone wants to know. Are you going to build a plant yourself? Or?
So I think it's an all of the above approach. We certainly are looking at front-end opportunities, but I think they work in synergy with these new tariffs. I think when we think about how large industry can engage in these challenges, we need to focus on where we sit. At the end of the day, Dow Chemical, Nucor, Microsoft, Google, we are large industrial customers of the utility, and the more we can leverage that customer-utility relationship, the greater the value is that we can unlock for all of the players and ensure that everyone is engaging at their core competencies. And so front-end investment is definitely something that folks are talking about, and I'm sure Adrian probably has some additional comments about that as well. But it's really focusing on that utility-customer relationship that I think is where our greatest success is going to lie.
I'm going to be a little bit more blunt. There is a narrative out there right now that there is a ridiculous amount of money in tech. Obviously, there is. Tech companies are very wealthy. Our capital is better deployed building data centers. We make a return on data centers, right? What we bring to the party is our ability to do long-term offtake, take some initial, potentially higher costs for first of a kind, as long as we have a path to nth of a kind, and our ability to help from a policy and regulatory perspective. To be blunt, are we going to own a nuclear project? Likely no. I have to be very clear though, like in the last 5 years, the electricity markets have changed so much. So like pre-COVID, I would have said, the markets are pretty cool. During COVID, I'd been like, oh God, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. Uri was wild. And now we're in this environment where load growth is just exponentially exploding, right? We are taking an approach of all of the above. Will we likely invest in some type of research and development for something like microreactors or other things? Will we invest in the use of cloud and AI services to help regulatory processes, to help generation, to help utilities? Yes, definitely. it is really unlikely that we're going to deploy our capital into funding the development of SMRs or larger projects, because typically what would have to happen is we'd have to have some way to recoup those costs. And with the uncertainty of projects being built and things like that, I don't think that's going to be deployed in first of a kind. If we get through first of a kind, maybe to nth of a kind, and we can do capacity credits, things like that, there may be deployment of capital. But right now, our capital is best deployed so we make returns on data centers. We are doing all of the above, though, through tariffs, through partnerships. And I also don't mean to sound like there's not a lot of capital out there. There is a good amount of capital that we're seeing from investors and so forth that are looking for strong commitments to offtake, but not for one project. They're looking for long-term projects. One of the things you may have heard is that we're both talking about 2030 right now for our carbon-free goals. Obviously, uprating, bringing retired plants and others online is one of the ways we can get there by 2030. New power projects like Vogtle 5 or SMRs are post-2030 in most circumstances to meet our need, at least from a capacity basis. But we're trying to lay the groundwork for those in the future.
I would love to just jump in for a minute on this.
You don't work for Meta anymore, sorry, no.
But you can give a better answer maybe now that you don't work.
Well, the thing people seem to love more than the former head of energy strategy for Meta is the immediately previous head of energy strategy for Meta. So look, on capital availability, I do just want to double down on something that Adrian said, which is that we have plenty of capital available in the marketplace. So I sat at Meta for 10 years. I share the same view that Adrian does. Like, private capital from tech companies is probably not the solution for this, nor should it be. So the thing that these companies bring, long-term credit-worthy offtake, that is the thing which is most scarce in power markets. Let's use that as a tool to unlock private capital. I've been out of Meta for about 2 months now. I've been spending a lot of time talking to investors, venture capital, growth equity, infrastructure, across the board. There is interest in the space. We've seen venture capital deploying into new technology. I think that's great. Is that going to get projects built? Probably not. So why are we seeing the larger pools of private capital sitting on the sidelines, given that we have all of the incentives, tax incentives, and otherwise going to the sector? We've got growing pools of aggregated demand for the projects, and I think that this is a really interesting question. So I think, first of all, we do have a little bit of creative problem solving to do to figure out, all right, how do we take long-term credit-worthy offtake and translate it into something which is bankable? Fortunately, we've got folks like Microsoft and Google working on this. They are the most creative structuring entities out there commercially. I think we're going to see a lot of interesting stuff happening through the AMC and otherwise. But we also have a couple of pieces that are still open questions for people. In particular, some mechanism for insurance related to cost overrun and other risks on projects does feel like that could be one last important policy tool to get some of these projects over the finish line. I think that that's something that we should all be working on. But capital is available. So if we can figure out how to align the pieces of the puzzle we have today, maybe bring in just a little bit of additional support and bolstering mechanism around the edges, we will see capital flowing in. It's standing by, it's ready, and it's available. So again, I think this notion that like the tech companies are going to come in and write a check to save the day is misguided. Let's use them for that credit that they are bringing to the table, which should unlock some of these other pools of capital if we can get it all aligned.
Yeah, and I think on the innovative part, like, we can prepay for power purchase agreements and so forth. What we have to be careful of is capital lease accounting. We don't want to mark to book a several billion-dollar asset that has regular swings that then our CFO looks at and goes, wow, why did our EPS go up and down because you invested in this plant? So we can bring some prepay type structures where it's, sub 45% of the capital cost or something like that, depending on what the IRS guidance is these days. But there are lots of structures we are looking at, and there will be some interesting announcements in the coming months on some of these things.
We'll look forward to hearing those. And one question I guess I would like to ask, you brought the idea of cost overrun insurance and all like that. From a policy perspective, if you were, I think someone asked me a question last night, if you're king, not president, king for a day, and you could implement policy changes, whether state level or national level, one kind of thing that you'd implement, which you can't go to cost overrun insurance. We've already mentioned that. What would help to really be able to unlock some of that capital and really move forward on deployment. It's a one-type policy change there, so to each of you, I guess. But you can jump in whoever wants to jump in first. But that said, I appreciate all the, that's being done absent those policy changes, and noting we got a lot of
not in government
investment
affairs.
My answer was cost overrun insurance. So.
which one?
My answer was cost overrun insurance.
I would say state level. More consistency on the state level, CPCN process and so forth, because you're looking at deploying a lot of capital before you have any certainty there, right? And so I think some level of standardization across some of those processes. But again, I'm not in government affairs, so if I say much more than that, I will get myself in trouble.
Okay, and don't want you to get yourself in trouble here, though, so. Adam?
In terms of capital specifically, a lot of it's already been done. The IRA investment tax credits is like having nuclear's on sale. All clean energy is on sale. You can take a huge portion of that cost and write it off in your tax credit. The remaining concern is project level risk and uncertainty, which is why cost overrun insurance is still being discussed so heavily, although not directly proposed. But the federal government has already provided significant financial incentives, so there's limited appetite for some members of Congress to provide more huge incentives in terms of financial. So the next step, I agree, is state level or PUC level barriers where the PUC is worried about the potential for overrun and therefore is going to disapprove or at least slow walk a project that, fundamentally or in the end ends up being a barrier to that project.
Okay.
Look, and just to be clear about this, I think it is important to recognize the notion that if we are out here asking for things like cost overrun insurance, that there's a bit of a put your money where your mouth is, and demonstrating that there is a willingness and an appetite to get projects done at a meaningful and significant level in exchange for such a policy. So I do think that that's fair. That's something that I've certainly heard in conversations around. But I also think you've got a bunch of buyers up here, my former employer, others, who are sitting out there saying, yeah, we're willing to step up. But what I will say as someone that has worked for a company that has done gigawatts and gigawatts of PPAs is that we don't like to get retraded. And so I think once you have figured out how to structure a PPA, you understand what the fundamental economics are, and you go to your CFO and you get that approved, you can't have someone come back and say, oh, by the way, we were wrong. So there are probably ways to creatively structure around some of that. But ultimately, we have to figure out, back to that very opening point that I made, what is it going to cost and when is it going to be available? And to the extent that we can get there, I think we're really going to see a lot of potential for future deployments.
And just to build on that point, what we're communicating is that we're able to pay a premium to bring these resources forward in time, but the entities that are best suited to take on timeline risk and cost risk are not the off-taker, right? Those are elements that we don't have any control on once the PPA is signed on the dotted line. And so I think, to Peter's point, creating the right structure that balances that risk and that responsibility within the contract and does, take advantage of the premium that we are willing to pay today is where the solution's going to lie.
I would only say two things. Reasonably higher prices.
Correct.
I got myself in trouble in the last conference because I said we'd do that, and then someone pitched a price, and I was like, oh, yeah, no, sorry. No, whoops. So reasonable. I think the other piece is just having been in construction and infrastructure for a long time, I totally understand why people are asking for cost overrun insurance, but if you're building the project, that is your job to manage your costs and construction risk. I think that cost overrun insurance, if it was deployed to cover delays in government approvals or licensing, things like that, that makes sense. But I think trying to move away from burdening ratepayers to burdening taxpayers because you can't build projects on time and fast enough, I understand these are first of a kind, but I don't think that's the right way to look at this.
Can I just add to it? I'm sorry. So most proposals for cost overrun insurance right now aggregate about $3 billion. How much was Vogtle over cost? So this project, this proposal is not necessarily, even if it was enacted, it would not get us to scale. It would be the first 1 or 2 projects out of the pipe. But Congress would feel like this should solve it if the industry's asking for more. And it can't. You have 1 or 2 projects that goes over, and that's the whole program. And there will be no more after that. So let's solve the problem itself with something that is deployable and control potential overrun risks for something that is external to the deployment timeline, scope, such as Adrian just said, regulatory risk or other things that are out of the actual developer's purview. And use that to mitigate some overall project risk.
So I suppose I shouldn't ignore these questions that are sitting down here as well. So why don't I pass the first one to one of y'all? Just a general question on, do AI data centers have the same requirement as cloud data centers? If not, what are the differences?
Yeah, I can walk through that. There are 2 types of AI data centers. There are training data centers and there are inferencing data centers. Training data centers are the big ones, where you're dropping in gigawatts of load so you can teach your AI how to do things. You tell it, like, I want you to figure out this calculus equation, and you train it in that facility. Inferencing can actually be co-located with other cloud data centers and so forth. And that's basically once you've taught Copilot or something how to do something, that's itself just getting smarter as you're working with it in your Outlook or things like that. Training data centers, we don't fully know yet because there has not been a training data center that has been fully built on its own at a gigawatt scale. You can hypothetically foresee that those could be 3 nines versus 5 nines, which means that instead of having 99.99% power availability and reliability, you could hypothetically go down to a much lower standard of reliability, so you don't have to have as much backup diesel gensets or duplication of you don't have to have 2 AP1000s even if you only use 1. Those are the differences. Is there a play for nuclear because of the differences? I don't think that's it. I think it's because of the scale that we're building data centers now, whether it's cloud or AI. Like, literally, every time you all pick up your phone, you are using power in a data center. And as that process becomes more and more, as your cars use it more and everything like that, we're going to be building more data centers. So data centers are just going to start consuming more of our electricity on the grid. But I think that's completely manageable with nuclear and other assets.
Thanks. Okay, and our next question, does carbon credit play, if there was a carbon credit or anything like that, does that play into any of your...
It says, is it dead? I have a team called the Carbon Dioxide Removal Program. We did 5 million metric tons. It better not be dead because those are all carbon credits.
Yeah, I might just say that, I think thinking about carbon credits as it relates to any individual generating technology is probably not the right way to think about it, which is that, at least inside of voluntary markets and in places where people are tracking emissions associated with electricity consumption, which we call Scope 2 emissions, that is ultimately inside of these companies' net zero targets, and that is a very robust market and marketplace for corporate goal setting and otherwise. So right now, carbon credits aren't necessarily the mechanism that individual generators are issuing. It's RECs, renewable energy certificates, but those are being translated through into making emissions claims, and they are fundamentally tied to the ways in which companies are using this. So anytime you hear someone saying, hey, we're willing to pay some premium for this technology, it is at least in part so that they can take the environmental attributes and make claims against it for the many commitments that large companies have made. So, calling it a carbon credit, probably not the right way to think about it, but ultimately thinking about environmental attributes associated with these projects, yeah, vitally important to the ways that projects are getting done. And when one of the folks sitting on this panel needs to go up to that CFO's office and say, hey, I want to do this project, that is a big part of the way that they're likely thinking about it.
Okay, next one. Apparently there's rumor that there's a presidential election going on right now. So how does the politics, affect any of your decisions in this kind of a transitional year here?
You're really putting us on the spot with this one.
Yeah, that's why I deferred the question to y'all. I'm not touching that one.
Look, I think nuclear and carbon-free, like just building out our grids is a bipartisan issue, period.
Good answer, good answer, I think there. So question to Adam, how much does the back end, the fact that we would, like I say, I think Craig noted, we need to move forward still on resolution of the disposal and disposition of spent fuel. How does that affect deployment, you think?
It depends on the state. Some states have moratoriums on building new nuclear, period, until there is a final federal policy and disposal facility. Some states are just a little bit hesitant about what to do with the waste, and they're waiting to see what the federal government will do before they're going to largely support new nuclear. Some states are just supportive of it. They believe that spent fuel sitting on site is not actually a concern right now, and that the government will ultimately get to a final disposition on what to do with the waste. So it really is not a unified national view of whether it's a barrier or not. And there have been some efforts to address that problem one way or the other, and different states feel differently about whether those efforts are appropriate or not, and it's going to continue to be a non-uniform response to that question.
Thanks. Okay, so yeah, I like this next question too. What do you view the role of your companies, the big AI companies and the tech companies, as far as being advocates for nuclear power and help to educate the public on nuclear?
Yeah, I hope you can see that we are advocates for nuclear power. We are using our voice. We're all here on the stage today, obviously talking to the industry, but we are always publishing white papers to show the role for nuclear power in achieving decarbonization. We're engaging publicly through the AMC. I know Microsoft has a lot of other exciting nuclear-related announcements that you have put out as well. And so we are using our voice from where we sit in the market to show the promise in this technology as well as our support for it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think through the AMC and through some of we're going to release statistics from the AMC and sort of make some of our findings more public, anything that was non-confidential that we can. I think continued engagement on the regulatory front, policy front, having conferences, talking to folks. But I also think that in many ways you may not want us to fully be your advocates because we don't know the ins and outs, and you don't want a bunch of tech company folks necessarily doing all the speaking for you. But I certainly happy to weigh in and do things like this.
Okay, I'm intrigued by this last question, but I have to lean up to be able to see the rest of it. I'm gonna skip to this, question 8 here for us here. Because it's close to one question here I was going to ask. With so many different nuclear technologies, each facing its own challenges of technology development, financing, and regulatory risk, how does the buyer assess which technology is the most promising? And it kind of goes toward what do you think is it's probably a couple of years ago we went and talked about gigawatt-sized plants, and now we're talking about gigawatt-sized plants a lot more and all. What's your view? How do you make the decisions going forward in these technologies?
I've got a strong feeling on this one, which is the answer is they shouldn't. Just full stop. If Adrian wants to buy wind, he doesn't go talk to GE. He goes to talk to Avangrid or Invenergy or NextEra or one of the many other renewable energy developers who has been doing this for a long time and with more wherewithal and expertise than he or his team has. The notion that individual buyers should be assessing nuclear technologies for risk and all of these, it's a ridiculous concept. We need to have a coherent, well-established development sector for this space that large buyers can then interface with. We don't have that now. Most of the conversations that are happening between large buyers and the advanced industry are with OEMs. This has got to change. So, there may be a more politic answer to this question, but I personally feel very strongly that the answer to that is it is ridiculous to think that companies that are buying power will have any perspective, or at least a reasonable one, on technology considerations that are well outside of the core business. Doesn't make sense.
I agree with you. And I know some of you are going, well, look, we saw you posting for nuclear rules and things like that. I do have a nuclear team that helps me do due diligence, so I don't make really big mistakes when I'm going out to contract things. But we think partnerships with utilities and folks who know how to do this is a much better idea. Look, our job, Silicon Valley is let's break the model and do this faster, and it doesn't matter if we break things in software. I really don't want to break the power grid in any way, shape, or form, so we really do rely on experts that have been doing this for a long time.
I'll just jump in. I do think that it's important that we look at both large and small scale. And so it's really exciting to see AP1000s come online. We're excited for that cost curve to start coming down as we see more and more units deployed, and that scale provides more clean, firm baseload for each project that we build. I was also at the Kemmerer groundbreaking, and the excitement that we see in the small modular reactor space is intoxicating. And so we're really excited to see what comes forth. We're really excited to see the innovation that's going on, but I think that there's going to be a role for both large and small in the future of nuclear.
You know, I think that's actually a good, I was going to ask for closing thoughts, but I think that's actually a pretty good closing comment there. We need to be we all have roles in this, you with the nuclear industry partnering on this, and we've got a lot of technologies there to deploy, and it's pretty promising. So I think that's probably a good way to end up the panel here. So I thank the panelists for your insight and thoughts and for participating and being advocates on nuclear here as well as we move forward. So thank you very much. Could we get a round of applause for the panelists here?